This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are building the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and today I'm joined by Rick Ford, author of the new book, The Growth Capital Playbook: How Smart Founders Find the Right Partner, Scale Fast, and Build What Lasts. We're going to talk about how he went from being a self-described gas station kid in a one-stoplight town to building one of the largest privately held automotive groups in America. Over 4 decades, Rick built RFJ Auto Partners into a multi-billion-dollar company before leading its merger with Sonic Automotive, while also building a family office with investments across real estate, PE, and venture capital. This chat is the first of a special 2-part series. Today, we're focusing on Rick's origin story, the lessons he learned while building a multi-billion-dollar company, and the mentors, relationship, and life experiences that shaped the leader he became. Rick Ford, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you, Joe. I'm doing wonderful, and thank you for having me on with you today.
You're very welcome, Rick. And I want to start by talking about the concept of C to B, because in your book, you write about being the poorest kid in the poorest town with a one-stoplight, and you've gone on to amass like $1 billion company, which is just a remarkable story, which we're going to get into today. But I'm always been a believer in C to B. Like, you have to see something to be something. The perfect example is like Jackie Robinson in baseball. Like, black kids could never imagine playing professional baseball until they saw Jackie Robinson do it. So, I mean, obviously that's a grandiose example of it, but who did you see to be? Like, who was it that you were kind of either emulating or inspired by that drove you to this path?
I was fortunate enough, Joe, to have several examples, if you will, along the way. In my youngest years, I had an uncle that was really more like a father figure to me. And while he worked for the government, he worked for the Corps of Engineers. He started out as a Marine, Corps of Engineers, but the whole time he worked for the Corps for 30 years, he always was doing other things on the side. They bought houses that literally were falling down, and we would rebuild them and keep them as rental properties. So I learned to do everything from paint to carpentry work to roofing to HVAC. And my uncle, because he traveled 5 days a week for his job, he literally, this is a long time ago, but he would do correspondence courses. And he taught himself how to be an electrician. He taught himself how to be a plumber. He
Wow.
taught himself how to do all these other things. And so I took inspiration from that. And his point to me was, if you're willing to put in the effort and the time, you can do anything you want to do. And he proved that, because like I said, he kept his job with the Corps of Engineers for 30 years, but he amassed an electrician's license, a plumbing license, and later in his years, he even became a locksmith because it was curious to him. He learned how
Wow.
to be a locksmith. And so that was something that I embraced. Both I was fortunate to embrace and learn work ethic from him, and also to learn that if you're willing to put in the time and continue to learn and continue growing, that's something I really never stopped doing throughout my lifetime, is continue to learn new things and grow. And I, I I encourage my children, my grandchildren all the time. I read a lot. In an average year, I'll read over 100 books.
Wow.
And so I encourage my children and grandchildren, and I'm afraid to say this, Joe, but it's becoming the lost art, if you really think about it, right? It's kids today read, but they read snippets. They read,
Right.
social media. They read just little, what we used to call the Reader's Digest version whenever I was young. Um, and there's so much that I think the younger generations could learn if they would really take the time to embrace reading and learn how to read again. But that's one of the key things that helped me along the way, is I was always able to continue to learn new things, and I had lots of. So that was just an early example. As I got into the car business, I learned very quickly that it didn't require, uh, certain educations weren't. There was no barrier of entry other than how hard you were willing to work, and if you were willing to do the right things over and over and over again every single day, that there was really no limit to where you could go. And I saw examples of that. People, when I got into the car business, it was something that you could still become a dealer, even if you didn't have deep pockets, you didn't have a lot of money.
Yeah.
It was a matter of, if you're willing to put in the time and the effort, find someone that believed in you to help you get a start. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And that was one of the things that attracted me to the auto industry, is that you saw a lot of self-made men in that industry. And that was something that, I knew, coming from a background I did where I didn't have anything. If I was going to do anything at all, it was going to be self-made. And so that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to that business that I was.
That's awesome. I love hearing that. And it's funny in the book you talk about this story where when you were handed a $120 check after your first week of work, and it's funny, it reminded me instantly of when I was a kid. I grew up in a working class immigrant family, and when I got my first full time job, I was still living at home. And this is kind of embarrassing to say out loud, Rick, but like I didn't cash any of the checks that I was getting from work because I was like, I wasn't spending money. I was basically living at home, going to work. And after a while, like, the actual business manager, the accountant of the radio station I was working at, like, calls me in, so like, "Hey, we wanna make sure, are you getting all the checks? Because if you don't cash them soon, they're gonna expire." I'm like, and I had no idea. I didn't know anything about expiring checks or anything like that. So I've realized the importance of making sure you keep an eye on that stuff, and as I've gotten older, I've realized how much of an idiot I was. But tell me about that moment of you getting that $120 check, and, what clicked when you got that?
Well, first of all, that was the most money I'd ever had in my hand at one time.
Wow.
Yeah, I know that, today, and obviously, that was a long time ago, 50 years ago. But at the same time, it was still, it gives you a perspective of where I came from that I'd never, it literally one time in my hand held over $100 in my hand ever. I'd grown up, you know, I started mowing the lawns for $5. I grew up doing things trying to save money, and trying to make money, and to be able to get a check of that size. It wasn't check, by the way. I got cash because I was
Oh,
too
cash,
young to
okay.
legally work. It was actual
Right,
cash. Yeah, I didn't.
right.
I didn't have the problem you did. There were no such thing. Well, first of all, I started working at 13, and so legally back then we didn't have the child labor laws that we have
Right.
today. But it was because of that, I got paid. I just got paid with cash, and so that was really neat, right? I got all this cash in my hand. I'm thinking, okay, what do I do with it? Well, in my case, I already knew what I wanted to do. I set out to save enough money to buy a car for my mother, and I mentioned in the book, my mother was disabled from the time I was 4, and it was when I bought her a car. I was 14 when I bought her a car. It was the first car she'd ever owned at that time with air conditioning. Now, if you live in the North, air conditioning, no big deal. You live in Texas, air conditioning is a big deal in a car.
Yes.
And so I was fortunate enough to save my money up that summer. Like you, I was living at home, didn't need money, didn't spend money. And I saved up all my money that summer and bought her a car that had air conditioning. And I was so proud. I kept that car long after she passed away. I kept that car for many, many years before I finally sold it. But taught me a valuable lesson that if you're willing to work hard, you can go do things that you might have never thought you could do before.
Yeah, and like you, I also dropped out of college to pursue, my life career and such, but, you dropped out and started selling cars, and Rick, as you know, that there is this sort of pejorative feeling of car salesmen as quote unquote sleazy. Like, when people think the sleazy salesperson, like the automatic image they doctor in their head is like the greasy salesperson in the parking lot trying to convince you to buy this vehicle. And again, I know that's become a cliche, but as you know, there are some truth to most cliches. Tell me about this idea of like walking away from college to pursue this career. Did you have any of those druthers of like, and I don't like, is this gonna be a step down for me? How did you embrace this idea of and again, this is way back when the idea of sleazy car salesman was a little more rampant, than there are today. I mean, hence we have lemon laws because of those kind of folks, Rick. But tell me what you were thinking when you decided to make that decision.
Well, first of all, the reality is that some of those cliches were accurate. In fact,
Yeah.
when I first started. Um, However, I had the good fortune of I grew up in a really, really small town. I talk about it in my book. I worked at a gas station. We only had one red light, and that was the only gas station until the days came around where someone opened a gas station at the far end of town that was a self-service. The first time I'd ever seen self-service gas station. And we only had one little used car dealer in the town we were in. And he actually was a pretty good guy, and I didn't know any different, right? So, he was a decent person, had been in that town forever, everybody knew him, and so he wasn't the traditional car salesman that we think of. And so, that was kind of my early introduction to the automotive business. The reality was I had a scholarship, a pre-med scholarship. So I was gonna go to college to become a doctor. So you can imagine my family, whenever I told them that I was going to drop out of college and I was going to not only drop out of college, go to work, but I was going to go to work selling cars.
Sure.
So they had obviously all the same visions and same opinions of a car salesman. My grandmother, I didn't think she was going to speak to me. Um, they had all those same original thoughts, and I remember my uncle who pulled me aside, the same one that truly made himself into something more than I ever could have dreamed of. He pulled me aside. He said, "Rick," he says, "it doesn't matter what industry you decide to go into, as long as you make the commitment you're going to be the best at that business, and you're going to do it with integrity and do it the right way." And so that was something that really stuck with me in the very, very early days. The gentleman I worked for, I talk about this in my book when I was working at the gas station. He was very, very strict with all of his employees, but he had a belief in delivering service. And when I talk about integrity, there wasn't a car that came in to get gas, and we would put gas in. Every single window on the car must be cleaned every time they came in. Side windows, front window, back window. You always open the hood. You always need. We didn't just check the oil. We checked the oil. We checked power steering fluid. We checked the transmission fluid. We checked their air filter every time they came in. Didn't matter if they were buying $5 worth of gas or if they were filling up their whole tank. We did that every time someone came in, and there was no shortcuts. If he saw you not clean all the windows all the way around, he would pull you in and say, "You have to understand, this is what we provide. We provide service, and we're going to provide it the right way every single time." And so those were great learning experiences for me. Now, eventually, over time, my family came to accept that I was in the car business. They came to accept that, maybe there could be some decent people in that business. But it probably didn't help that I would tell them stories that things that I did see that weren't such decent people. And I would tell them that, yeah, some of those cliches are very, very true.
Yeah.
And but I will tell you, it's like every other industry, right? You're going to typically have the 10%, 5% of the people that are really bad that you hear about all the time, and the other 90% that are really good people and are doing the right things you never hear about.
Yeah.
Same thing. You pick politicians, lawyers, you name it, all the professions that we talk about that are not well thought of or well respected. It's always the 5 or 10%, the bad apples that make everybody look bad.
Yeah.
And the car business was that same way. There were more buying away, far more good quality people. You'd be surprised at how much the average car dealer does in their local community for their community. We're always the ones that are supporting the little league teams. We're always giving, if most any high school you go to, you're going to see the car dealer's name on their scoreboard at the football field. I'm talking about Texas here, but local car dealers are part of the local fabric. And now, get into the major cities, you go to, Dallas, LA, et cetera. It's less prevalent that way. But the majority of the dealers are still in the smaller neighborhoods, smaller towns all across America. There you probably don't know this, Joe. Maybe you do if you did any research, but there's 2,500 Ford dealers across the United States. There's 1,000 Toyota dealers, right? So they're not all in, Los Angeles, New York,
Right.
Dallas, et cetera, right? They're across every, little small town and, smaller metropolitan area across the world or across the country. And so it's you'd be surprised just at how active and how involved each of those dealerships are in their community and doing the right things.
All right, you mentioned Ford dealerships, so I can't escape this conversation by talking about the giant pink elephant in the room. Your name's Rick Ford. Tell me about Rick Ford being going into the sales industry. Were you? You were very young, obviously. Were you aware of the weight of the Ford name in the auto industry and what it meant, and Henry Ford and all that jazz? Did you know anything about that?
Not even a little bit.
Wow.
But, obviously, I knew what a Ford car was, but had no concept that that was actually a family and a family that had owned started the business and truly one of the true pioneers of the auto industry. Not a clue. Didn't know any of that. So much so that my first job working at a car dealership was an Oldsmobile dealership, not even a Ford dealership. And of course, yeah, obviously, very quickly, I got indoctrinated to everybody else. Are you part of the Ford family? And I look at them like they were, I said, sure, Ford family from Kennedale, Texas. And they would laugh at me, right? And so I quickly had to go learn and become educated on the Ford family, the Ford legacy and dynasty. and all the great things that that family has done over the years. But no, I had no earthly idea. And I will tell you one little quick snippet that I think your audience will find interesting. I was a Ford dealer for many, many years, and I quickly moved from after Oldsmobile. I went to work for a Ford dealer. It just was, call it fate, call it whatever. But it was an opportunity that I had to go into management at 19 years old. I got an opportunity to be a manager, and it was at a Ford dealership. Fast forward many, many years later, where I'm actually a Ford dealer. Ford used to have, and they still do, they'll have meetings where they'll have their dealers from around the country come into one area. They'll do new car reveals, or they'll do, dealer meetings, dealer incentive trips, etc. And we went to the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado. Beautiful place. Could totally enjoy it. I go to check into the hotel and give them my credit card, mention my name. They said, "Oh, Mr. Ford, we're so glad we had the presidential suite all prepared for you. We'll have the we'll have the young man, your porter, come down and show you to your room." And I kind of chuckled a bit. I said, "You might want to double check the name on that reservation. I'm Rick Ford. I think you're talking about Bill Ford, who was also going to be there. And Bill probably doesn't want me sitting in his living room in the presidential suite when he comes
Right.
here."
That's
And so
hysterical.
they
What a
laughed. Well, they quickly, here's the Paul Harvey of this story. They quickly checked the room, said, "Apologize, you're right, Mr. Ford. We had the wrong room. We do have your room ready. And oh, by the way, here's your direction to the closet, the broom closet that we had you in at the far end of the hall."
Oh, what a great story. That's I gotta ask you because you mentioned that your first job was at Oldsmobile. Did they say, "Hey, Rick, you gotta change your last name to Rick Oldsmobile," or something like that because it would be a conflict of interest of being called a Ford at an Oldsmobile dealership? Was there any issue with that?
No, in the early days, I think that, and I was so young. I started at 17 at the car
Yeah.
dealership. Again, the laws and rules were different at that time, and so I don't know that they even knew what my last name was. They just called me the kid,
Oh,
and
that's funny.
and that's what they all thought of me as, was a kid, because I was working with older gentlemen that had
Sure.
been in the business. Some of them had been in the business 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Guys that were anywhere from 30 to 70 years old, and so I truly was in their eyes a kid. And
Yeah.
so that's what they call me. They just call me the kid. They didn't even call me by my
That's fine. It's funny how that is such a there's so much longevity in the car sales industry. A dear friend of mine here in Charleston is retired now, but he worked, I think he was like the GM of a Ford dealership for like 25 years, and he had the same sales team for the entire like he literally grew old with these people on his staff. And you see this in a lot of places where not to be like there's only old guys or old women working there, but you'll see a mixture of like a bunch of young people that are just starting and like a group of older folks that have been doing it for a long time. What is it about, or can you explain the longevity in that industry?
Well, I would say that it is in any industry, in any company, you'll see that. But what it happens is you find people you're comfortable working with, and you find a owner, business owner, and their operational philosophies, their strategies, their integrity matches
Yeah.
what fits your personality. Then you find that you're better off. We of course always want to hold on to our employees because of training costs, et cetera, et cetera. But more important for the employees, if you find somewhere you're comfortable, if somebody treats you right, their priorities and their integrity align with yours, what's the reason to move, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we found is we made a big focus. We always focus at RFJ on employee retention. And we had four pillars that we talk about in our book. Uh, our first pillar was first and foremost always employee satisfaction, and then customer satisfaction. And our reasoning behind that was the other four was market share and profitability. But let's focus on the first two: employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction. We learned, and I learned this early on in my career. If we took care of our employees and they were happy working for us and they wanted to work for us, they did a better job at taking care of our customers. Whereas if an employee was just we would call it, the clock watchers. If they were just coming in and punching the clock because they, wanted to get paid just for punching the clock, they typically did not take care of our customer as well. But if they truly enjoyed being there, they bought into our vision, they believed in the things we believed in, how we wanted to take care of our customers, they did a much better job for us. and the customers appreciated them more. And so for us, it goes to your longevity question. If you make it, we have found in the auto industry has done, lots and lots of surveys, and there are 20 of others, that done in other industries. But what we found was the things, we would ask, employees across our industry as a whole, what would make you, why would you leave a company, or why would you leave a dealership, or what makes you stay? And as managers, especially young managers, the first thing they always say to me, well, Rick, is always pay. We're losing people because we don't pay them enough. Well, then you do an anonymous survey with the employees, and pay typically comes in third or fourth, believe it or not. The number one reason is always who they work for, their manager. Number one, if they appreciate and enjoy who they work for, whether it's their direct manager or the senior management or the owner, if those things align and they feel like they're appreciated and that they're treated fairly, treated properly, all those things align, your turnover is cut in half immediately.
And there's a yin and yang to that, Rick, because if they feel respected and there's this culture of safety, if money does become an issue, they probably feel comfortable enough to be like, "Hey, boss, I love working here, but I'll need this amount or I'll have to leave." So in a way, it opens the dialogue. Whereas if they just hated the person, they're like, "I'm out of here. Here's my 2 weeks. I'm out," or not even give the 2 weeks. But if you build this culture of people feeling safe, respected, cared for, if it comes down to money, they can be open and honest and be like, "Hey, here's the deal. Love working here, but is there anything you can do about pay?" I'm just assuming that's probably the kind of culture you create with that kind of environment, right?
You're 100% right. It gives you that dialogue is really what we call it, and open and honest dialogue. And I used to encourage my direct reports, and more importantly, as I became managed multiple locations, I would encourage my management team. Sometimes you'll have an employee that will come to you and tell you they have a business offer, have an opportunity to go and take a job, and whether it's a step up a management position, as an example, at another location or competitor. And I always encourage my people, take an honest and fair assessment of that position of what they're telling you. And if we don't have a position that they can move into for whatever reason, either there's just not one open, or we don't see one opening in the near future, or they're not prepared, or we don't think they're ready to take that position, I always encourage them to take and explore that. And we would always try to help them to be successful in whatever that next venture was, even if that's working for a competitor. And what I found was by doing that, if we were open and honest, if somebody comes to me and says, Rick, I can get a 30% raise by taking this position at a competitor, and the benefits are equal, the people are going to take you good integrity, they're going to treat us well, and it's an opportunity for learn, but it just so happens they have an opening that you don't have or that we don't have, I would always encourage them, try to help them. And by doing that, what I found, Joe, is that if for some reason things didn't work out, if somebody misled them, or they went there and found out they really weren't ready yet, and we were correct in thinking they weren't ready, you'd be shocked at how many times I had employees that would come back to me 3 months later, 6 months later, a year, sometimes 2 or 3, 4 years later. And they'd say, I've so much enjoyed working for you. I tried it. You gave me the opportunity. You encouraged me to go explore it because you're honest with me. You said you couldn't match or couldn't do whatever I was trying to do. But I found that now I've gotten better. I've learned more, and I'd like to come back and come back to work for you. Or it didn't work out for some reason. Can I come back to my old job? And oftentimes we would make a place for them and try to make a place, because if they're good people and they did a good job for us before, we wanted them to come back. We saw about doing that. And if you think about it, not a lot of companies, when you get ready to go and leave, if you tell them you're going to leave, it's oftentimes, here's your box, hit the door, we don't want to talk to you again. We're mad at you, especially if you're going to work for a competitor. I never believed in that. I believed that if someone had a good opportunity, now it always boiled down to where they truly was whoever was trying to hire them being honest, but they had a fair and a good opportunity to better themselves and better their situation for their family. I wanted to not only encourage it, but to support it. Because I wanted to ultimately, I used to tell my people all the time, whatever is ultimately best for the employee will be best for the company in the long run. We may have short-term pain. We may have short-term, uh, you know, things where we have to scramble around and, have to overcome, shortcomings for the short period of time, that cause, what I call short-term distractions. But long-term, if you have an employee that feels like can have a better opportunity somewhere else, and you discourage them from taking it, or you don't allow them to take it, or whatever else may happen, where they end up staying, they're always going to be thinking about, should I have taken that opportunity? What would have happened if I had taken that opportunity? And they ultimately they're going to come back to, they feel like that you weren't fair with them. And so I always encourage my people, if it's a really good opportunity, if it's good for the employee, it's ultimately going to be best for the company, even if it does cause short-term pain or distraction for the company. And that's the way we approached it.
Yeah, it's awesome. And you know, it's funny. We jumped ahead a little bit because you built RFJ into this incredible company. But let's step back a little bit. What inspired you to build it at that point in your career? And we're going to get into what you're doing and how successful it became. And obviously, you've laid out sort of the culture piece of it. But tell us the origin story real quick about RFJ.
So RFJ, interestingly enough, I had the good fortune of working for, and you can see it in my book, I worked for really good, what we call private dealers, private capital dealers. Um, and there came a time where well, I don't want to get into too much into the health, but I had a heart attack at 39 years old.
Wow.
And so so I took a step back. I was a dealer, was running, and I was a partner with another dealer in running a dealership. So I took a step back and had to really take care of my health and get healthier. Whenever I came back after a 6-month hiatus and 9-month hiatus, I came back and said, okay, I'm ready to go back to work. And a friend introduced me to a gentleman that um, was working for one of the public companies called AutoNation. And he said to me, Rick, he said, I've heard lots about you. I know you're a good operator, et cetera, et cetera. I've got an opportunity I think you might be interested in. They said, give you a chance to really grow beyond what you've done before. You're going to be able to manage multiple locations instead of a single location. But the downside is you're going to have to move to South Texas. I'm like, wow. So it was going from major metro. I'd always been either Dallas or Houston. And now is going to go to South Texas and manage a group of stores where they own 6 stores in one little town. And, but it was the opportunity. Again, for me, in my mind, it was an opportunity to learn and to grow. And even though I'd already gone to the point where I'd become a dealer, become a general manager, partner, dealer, this was an opportunity for me to learn something I didn't know. And so I got the good fortune of going to work for a public company. That was AutoNation. What's interesting is you're going to hear this name over and over again in my book. That gentleman that hired me to work for AutoNation was a gentleman named Jeff Dyke. You might recognize that name because later on, again, skipping ahead, whenever I sold RFJ and we merged to Sonic Automotive, the president of Sonic Automotive was none other than Jeff Dyke. So it goes to tell you that number one, it's a small world and you never want to burn bridges. And number two, relationships are incredibly valuable in our business, no matter what you do. But he gave me an opportunity. So that's kind of the next of where it started. I went to work, had the good fortune going to work for a public company. And I learned multiple location management, which I'd never done before. Most dealerships at that time, especially early on, when I started working for AutoNation in 2000, they'd only been around for just a few years. They were very, very new. I think they started buying new car dealerships in 97, 98, 96, somewhere in that range, late 90s. I started working for them in 2000. They were still in very early growth mode, buying dealerships, really in the early days of developing processes and operational strategies and so forth. And so I had the good fortune of learning and be able to learn that, and also being introduced to one of the great mentors of my life. It's also in my book, a gentleman named Mike Maroney, who to this day I still talk to once a month, and I reach out to him, and every single time we'll schedule an hour together, and I'll learn something. And Mike's now been retired for a few years from AutoNation. He's couldn't stay retired for fully, so he's bought several more dealerships now,
Sure.
and he has
As one
his
does.
family are running those. Everybody
Yeah.
seems to do that. I'm the same
Yeah.
way, right? But he now has a group of dealerships that his son-in-law and his nephew are running. And anyway, so that's what started me down that path. Well, worked for AutoNation. Then I went and left and went to work for Sonic Automotive. Jeff Dyke had gone to Sonic. And I actually became a regional vice president for Sonic, running a group of, I had 32 dealerships for Sonic. And this is what leads me to this story of how in the world does RFJ come about? I was at a dealer trip, and we talked about that earlier. I was at a dealer trip for one of our import dealerships, and I was in Spain. I'll never forget. And one of the dealers was one of the OEMs was introducing a new model that was going to compete with Mercedes. It was a German luxury brand. And so I happened to be there, and there were probably, I don't know, 40 dealers there from around the US. And we're test driving cars, and you get to know all the dealers at different places. And one of the dealers that had a couple of dealerships had one dealership in Houston and one in Dallas. He pulls me aside and says, "Hey, Rick," he said, "things are getting a little bit tough." This was in 2009, 2010.
Oh, sure.
So we're
Post
coming to it.
crash.
We
Yeah.
just come post crash, right?
Yeah.
The business was really difficult. And he pulls me aside. He says, "Rick," he said, I got an issue. I won't get into all of his details, but he had a cash crunch issue. He said, "I need to sell one of my dealerships. Do you think I could sell it to Sonic?" And I said, "I don't really know for sure if we haven't, we obviously were really focused at that time. Cash conservation, all the things that everybody was focused on
Keep
getting
the
through the
lights on.
crash."
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That was our number one focus, right? And I said, "I don't know, but let me talk to him and I'll see." And he gives me a dollar figure that he wants for his dealership. And I happen to know I can do it in 5 minutes, knowing his dealership, because we had two other dealerships with the same brand and make in that same town. So I knew exactly what his dealership, knew where it was. I knew what it should be making, et cetera, et cetera. And he was willing to sell it for literally pennies on the dollar, probably 20 cents on the dollar, what it was really worth.
Wow.
And because he needed cash and needed it fast. And he knew that Sonic could both write a check and get approval. So I went to my boss, Jeff, and I said, "Jeff, here's an opportunity for us to pick up a dealership at a really, really attractive price." And he had, he met with the CFO and CEO and, the team there. And they came back to me and said, "Rick, it's a great opportunity, but we just aren't in a position where we can expand. We've got to hold on to every dollar to make sure that we weather the storm." And I totally get it now, having ran, a large group, and, cash flow is always something you're thinking about and making sure you got reserves. And so I had to go back and tell this dealer no. But what it did was it started me thinking about how many other dealers are in that same situation. And so at the time, I was the president of a charity. It goes back to dealers and how involved we are in the local community, right? I was the president of a local charity in Fort Worth. And one of my board members on the charity, and by the way, the charity was called Speedway Children's Charity. We focused on raising money for children in the local area. And one of the board members was an ex race car driver and just loved cars. We were associated with Texas Motor Speedway, which is the NASCAR track, in Fort Worth. And so he was a car guy, and he used to always pull me aside. He drove Porsches, and I forget which one of the European tours he drove on. And so there was just a natural connection there because of cars, and we had all these different brands. One day we were talking after one of our board meetings, and I told him about this situation that came up. I said, "It's too bad that Sonic, we're in a position where we're really tightening the belt." And he said to me, "So Rick, why don't we go buy it?" And I said, "Well, I don't know about that." I said, "First of all, I don't know that I want to just own one dealership. I've done that. I want to
Yeah.
own multiple dealerships." He said, "Oh," he said, "that's not a problem. We can go raise capital with no problem. I got lots of friends." And he was affiliated with family offices. He managed real estate portfolios for family offices. He said, "These family offices are always looking for, great opportunity to put money to work." And that's what started me down that path. And I said, "Well, let's go explore it. I've got this deal that I know is a great deal, and I know there are other deals out there." And so I started, kind of just asking some people in the industry I knew, and they said, "Yeah, Rick, prices are down." At that time, they were down probably 2 times. So everything in our business is sold on a multiple of earnings. You're familiar with that and the way
Yeah.
the business are sold. The business, our industry was down as a whole about 2 turns for what
Wow.
the traditional values were. So
So give me
if a
give
dealership
me some
traditionally,
context. So what would
okay,
say if it wasn't 2008, what would the value of that uh dealership typically been? Ballpark it. Like give it to me what it normally would have been if it had not been post recession and all that jazz.
great concept. So if a dealer, let's just take a raw example for
Yeah.
easy math. Let's say a dealership was making $1 million a year in earnings in that time in 2008. That means in pre 2008, they were probably making 2 million because they were off about
Oh,
50%.
wow. Okay.
Most dealers were.
Okay.
And what's more importantly, pre 2008 crash, that's all brands are based on what brand they are. It's what multiple they'll receive. So as an example, An average Ford dealership might sell for 3 times earnings. An average Toyota dealership is going to sell for 5 or 6.
Got it.
An average Porsche store is going to sell for 10, right? So it depends on the brand as to what multiple they get. But let's just use the lower, let's just use a mid, say 5 times. So if that dealership was earning $2 million pre-crash and the valuation was 5 times pre-crash, that dealership then would sell for $10 million. Okay.
Okay.
Now, let's go post-crash. We're coming out of the crash, but the earnings are down at $1 million, and the multiple is down 2 times, meaning instead of 5 times, it's down to 3.
Wow.
So now that same dealership that would have sold for 10 million, you're going to get 3 times the 1 million. It's selling for 3 million instead of 10.
Oof.
So incredible opportunity to buy at a really lower barrier entry rate. Now, not every deal was like that. Some dealers were doing fine. They were able to weather the storm. They're like, I'm not selling cheap.
Right.
However, there were a lot of dealers that were, as you've mentioned earlier in our conversation, getting long in the tooth, been doing it for a long time, and battling through the crash was hard. I mean, there were dealers that lost their financing source, they lost their banking relationships. I mean, we saw Chrysler and we saw General Motors go through bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Remember that? Most
Sure.
people forget. That was unbelievable what it did to the industry. And both Chrysler and General Motors closed down hundreds of dealerships.
Yeah.
It literally just terminated their franchise.
Wow.
And so if you're a dealer and you're running your business, all of a sudden you no longer have a franchise. You don't have new cars to sell. Imagine what that does. And so now put yourself in the psyche of a dealer that's been doing it for 30, 40 years. He's made a great living. His kids have gone on and gone off to college and they're doing something else. And so they don't have any, the next family member to take over to run the business. And now they've gone through what arguably is one of the most difficult times in the business, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years that I was in it. And so they're coming out of that and they're thinking, wow, I'm just tired, right? I mean, how much I've made my money. So I've got enough money, whether I sell the business or not, it's not going to change the way I'm in my retirement going forward. And so there are a lot of dealers that said, you know what, I'll sell even if it is lower than what it would have been 3 years before. I don't want to wait 5 years for it to come back
Right.
because I just don't want to work another 5 years to get there. And so that created an opportunity to buy dealerships at great values.
And so when you decide to finally buy, did you start with one or were you all in about like buying multiple at the same time?
I started with one and I bought one after first of all, I went to my boss, Jeff Dyke. I said, Jeff, I've
Oh,
got
that's
this
right.
vision. I want to
You
go.
had the little pesky problem of telling your boss that you were
That's
starting your
right.
own company. Right. There was that too. Yeah.
Well, again, you asked about it earlier in our conversation, though, when you had that kind of relationship with your employees, I had that kind of relationship with my boss.
Yeah.
I felt comfortable. I could be honest with him, and he treated me. I knew he was going to treat me fairly, regardless, and he would be honest with whether he thought it was a good idea. If he had told me, Rick, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, I'd had to rethink about it, right? But he didn't. He was supportive. He said, "Hey, I understand. There's great value that could be created," and he understood my concept. I, wrote out a whole business plan and I showed it to him. And he said, "Hey, I think it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be hard, a lot of risk, but I think," he said that to me. He said, "I think you could pull it off." He said, "I'll support you any way I can," which was incredible, right? And so I left and started talking to some family offices. I got my first introduction to private equity.
Mm.
But it takes time to do that, and it takes time to build that. And so at the same time, I found out that most, whether it be family office or private equity, they want to have an existing business that they can build upon. They very seldom do startups. That's just not something that family office or private equity does. And so it quickly became apparent to me I'm better off to buy a dealership. And so I did that. I bought my own dealership first. And then that really opened the doors to, okay, now how do we grow it? And how do we become what ultimately RFJ became? But what most people don't know, and I talk about it in my book, is that while everybody has read in our industry, they all read the automotive news article where 0 to 24. It looks like, RFJ became this overnight success. We bought 24 dealerships in 24 months, and we ultimately had 50 dealerships over the course of our 7 years before we sold. What nobody knows, and what most people didn't realize was it took 4 years to get to that first one, right?
Right.
Well, I bought the first one, but it took 4 years to where we actually started. Where I found during that period, I found the right capital partner, I found the right opportunities, and then we started buying stores. So I leave Sonic in 2010, buy my first dealership in 2011. I don't start RFJ till 2014, middle of 2014.
Wow.
So I was a very long and coming overnight success.
Oh, that's great. And I want to put a pin in our conversation here because we're going to stop there. But the next time we pick up, we're going to talk about that growth from that 1 to 24 in 24 months. But you can read all about it in the Growth Capital Playbook, how smart founders find the right partner, scale fast, and build what lasts. His name is Rick Ford. Rick, I look forward to the second part of our conversation.
Thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed being on with you today.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to learn more about Rick and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.